of a Jesus girl. Jesus girl. Hey, it's the diary of a Jesus girl. Let the wings of the Spirit of the Lord just swirl. You are in it, but you know you're not a part of this world. If for the swine, you should never cast your pearl. Yes, it's just the diary of a Jesus girl. The diary of a Jesus girl. Welcome to the Diary of a Jesus Girl podcast, where we discuss real life issues of the committed Christian woman. This podcast will inspire you to love Jesus and impact lives like Jesus. And now it's time for your host, Crystal Day, award-winning author, speaker, and Christian coach.
Welcome to another episode of the Diary of a Jesus Girl podcast with yours truly, Crystal here. And I am a week away from my birthday, y'all. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'm as excited as I sound right now, but I mean, you give God thanks in all things. And I am, just looking forward to see, how God will show up. Birthdays are always special, so I'll probably do a birthday episode next week. Let's see. But let's see how it goes. For this week, though, I am touching on a topic that is a little bit, I feel like this is one of the topics in Christendom that we talk about a lot. I mean, sometimes I'm like, oh my God, how much time can we talk about this topic? But then what you find is that it's so necessary to always talk about this topic because it continues to be a challenge in so many believers' life, so many persons' life. And that is the topic of forgiveness. And some persons might hear this and like, oh, another talk about forgiveness. I'm over this forgiveness. But there's so much that you can learn. There's so much that you can, just not just learn, but you're not just learning for you, but you're learning so that you can also share with others that God might send and to you and to be able for you to impact their life. So it's always a blessing just to hear different perspective of how the Lord will have persons talking about this topic. Now, for this week, I have another Bayesian sister in the house. Last time we had Kimisha King from Barbados here. Woo-hoo. And we have had Vicky Oaton, also another Bayesian, another Bayesian sister, also. So it is also, it's great to be able to connect with other Caribbean women that are making an impact. So I want to welcome Jewelle Maynard-Roberts to the podcast. Welcome, Jewelle.
Hi, it's awesome to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Crystal. And happy birthday in advance.
Thanks. So, Jewelle, we want to just jump into the conversation, right? Because we want to get into knowing a little bit about you. So you can tell us a little bit about you and tell us, your conversion story. So for all the guests that we have here, we talk about our conversion story. How did you come to Christ? Did you grow up in church? What was that, defining moment that, hey, I need Jesus? So tell us a little bit about you growing up and then tell us how you came to Christ.
Well, I grew up in Barbados as a church girl. My parents were both trained at theological college. That's where they met. My dad was a pastor and my mom is also now a pastor as well. And I spent so much time in church. I literally ate, slept, and breathed church every single week. Sometimes you were in church 3 times or 4 times through the course of the week. That was what my childhood was like. A very traditional Christian, kind of strict upbringing was the upbringing that I had. And although that would suggest an early coming to Christ, for me, it took me a little while. It was probably about 15 years old or so when I finally decided to give my heart completely to God. And that happened in a youth group session that we had. And the author at the time, we had a guest speaker. That person, they were talking about whether God is pleased with us. And at that point in my life, I really came to terms with the fact that I needed to get myself in the right position with God to ensure that he was pleased with me. And when he looked at me, he could smile and say, this is a child of God. This is one of my children. And so I stepped into that relationship with him at that time. And even though I did that, it still took me a few years before I got to the place of a complete and total surrender. I think that surrender completely to him and allowing him to have his total will in my life in every single area is very much a work in progress. So that is pretty much my conversion story. It's not very exciting, but it is the story that is mine. And I am very grateful for the upbringing that I did have.
Nice. But here where I'm going to start. You grew up in church, have an experience with Christ from age 15. What do you know about forgiveness? Like, you should have been, like, that should not be your struggle. Like, that's for us that, don't know Jesus and come to Jesus at our young age. So tell us about that forgiveness piece. Like, what were some of the, life altering moments that happened for you that, made forgiveness an issue for you?
Well, this is very interesting that you should say that, because, we assume that because we have had knowledge of a thing sometimes, that when it comes to have to actually put it in practice, that it will just snap into place and it will work, right? And I think that for a long time as a Christian, you kind of thought that you had it covered, and you thought that, okay, I've got this forgiveness thing down packed already. I know what to do and how to do it, because this is something I've heard of. As you said, we talk about it a lot in the church. This is something I've heard of. This is something I know. I should know how to do this. But then when you go through life and you have some life experiences, you experience some trauma, you have some life challenges, you then have to come face to face with the reality that the knowledge that you have, you now have to put that into practice in real life situations. And that, I think, is where the challenge comes. And that was where the challenge came for me, putting that forgiveness into practice to transform my life situations and where I was at the point in time. So if I would give you more specifics on this, the journey of me writing this book, Rescue Me, the Lifeline of Forgiveness, began with a season of my life when I said to God, that was back in about 2014. I said to God, God, you're calling me to do certain things and I want to step into your will. I'm going to say yes to what you lead me to do. And that led to a series of events happening in my life. There was job losses. There were accidents. There was my son being born prematurely. There was my father passing. My husband and I, we lost like 8 members of our family in about 16, 18 months in a very short space of time, going to funeral after funeral. There were so many things that happened in the course of a short space of time, so many bits of trauma, some relationship issues as well that occurred during that time. And as a result, I found myself face to face with a situation where that emotional space on the inside of me, I really was struggling to maintain a good space emotionally. I was in a place where from time to time, I would go through a season of sadness, a season of discouragement and depression, we would call it that. And that began to happen almost every year or so for a while. And it all came to a head back in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic when I had my second child. And I had to cope with what was a combination of all of the trauma that I had been through before that was unaddressed, unresolved, plus a bout of what would be termed as postpartum depression, perinatal depression, and so on. I had to deal with all of that. And I was crying out to God and saying to God, I don't know how to cope in this situation. I feel as though it would be better for me to just disappear from life because this is too much for me to bear, too much for me to carry. And what God spoke into me, he used a couple of people to speak, but he also spoke to me in my own personal times of prayer and devotion and so on. He said to me, forgiveness is your lifeline, and forgiveness will rescue you from the sea that you are in. He said, you're drowning. Forgiveness is your lifeline, and forgiveness is going to rescue you from the sea that you are in. And then he took me through the process of writing a devotional series, and then that turned into the book, and it went through aspects of forgiveness that I needed to deal with in order to address some portions of what I was going through from an emotional standpoint. He talked about forgiving God, forgiving him for some of my disappointments. I had to forgive myself for some of the things in my life that I did not quite feel that I had done in the right way. I had to forgive others for some of the things that I had gone through in relationship with others. So there were a lot of areas of unforgiveness that I needed to address in order to help heal some of the trauma that I had been through and to bring me back to a good emotional place. So that is how I got from the church girl that kind of knows about forgiveness and thinks she's got it covered to someone who realizes, hey, I have so much work to do. And to put this into practice, I'm going to really need to go through a process of breaking this down and understanding where I need to apply forgiveness and how to do that.
Okay, nice. I want to touch a little bit about motherhood before we get more, because
Sure.
like you mentioned, having a child that's born premature and then dealing with, COVID baby and that depression. One of the things I do find that as mothers, is almost like we shouldn't complain when things are not going our way because, we should just give thanks because, other people. And as a result, sometimes our real emotions are just suppressed.
Yes.
So talk to us a little bit about just your transition into being a mother. What were some of the emotions that you were feeling, and, how did you deal with some of those emotions?
I think I could split that into two parts because the experience was different with my first child and my second child. So the first child, my son, he's going to be 7 this year. And when he was born, he had quite a dramatic childbirth experience. I had traveled while I was pregnant. I was about 6 months pregnant, 24 weeks or so. And I was in good condition. I got my all clear from my doctor because I asked his permission first before I went anywhere. I traveled to the States, and 2 weeks into my trip, even after being very kind and gentle to my body, not doing too much, just kind of taking it easy for that time, I went into labor prematurely. And I spent about a week in hospital, and my son was born at 24 weeks. So he was very, very early, 3 months early. He spent 3 months in hospital, and I had to stay in the States with him for 3 months during that time. And I can tell you that was a crazy transition into motherhood, because I think when I initially knew that I was pregnant, I was excited. I was happy. I had all these plans and ideas. What would my child be like? You have all these dreams and visions of the future that you will create for that child. And then he is born unexpectedly at a time that I did not anticipate that he would come. I remember very distinctly after delivering that child, I remember my mom had flown up to meet me in the States when she heard that I was going into labor. She got on the next plane. She flew up to meet me. And I remember she wheeled me in the wheelchair over from where I had delivered to where the baby was in the neonatal care unit in the NICU. And I remember staring into that incubator and looking at my child. He was so small and just being at a loss for words. I did not know how to cope with that in that moment. I cried. I was really in a place of grief because I was saying to God, how could this happen? What do I do from here? He's so small, I felt so helpless and so helpless, so unable to deal with what was happening. I couldn't help him, and that for me it was quite a traumatic experience. And that was still in my process of kind of managing with that, as well as the death of my father happened 2 weeks after that while I was still in the States, watching my son. I was actually sitting next to that same incubator when I got the call that my father passed. So there were a lot of emotions happening at that time. There was grief. There was, a lot of uncertainty about the future. And then a few years later, my son was diagnosed with autism. Children who are born prematurely, they do have quite a lot of setbacks sometimes. And in his case, I know that he had some setbacks. In my mind, I was always saying, I kept positive. I said, he's going to catch up. He's going to catch up. And then about 3 years after his birth, I had that indication that he might be autistic. And it was like if the floor... if somebody ripped the floor out from under you, that is how I felt. Literally, like the floor just ripped out from under me, because that was nowhere at all in my thinking. I never thought that could be a diagnosis that would be attached to him. And the way in which it happened, there was never any indication from any of the doctors or therapists or anyone that he was seeing. And then very suddenly you're hearing this child might be autistic. And that in itself was also quite a journey of having to release the child that I thought I would have and accept the one that I do. And for mothers who have children with special needs, they will tell you that you grieve the child you thought that you would have. It's not that you're not happy, and it's not that you're not blessed and you're not grateful for the child that you have. Yes, you are. And you're grateful for the miracle of his life, because it's possible that he might not have survived being born so early. But at the same time, I had to go through that emotional process of grieving and letting that grief go and accepting the child that I did have. You love that child, but it is a process, an emotional process that you have to go through to say, okay, God, you know that I am the person for this child. You would not have given me this child if you didn't know that I am the person to carry this, to walk with this child, to see him through his life process. If it wasn't for me, it would not have come to me. So I had to go through that acceptance. And I think that was the emotional process for my first child. And for my second child, I very much had to deal with the postpartum, the perinatal depression. There were a lot of hormonal imbalances. I think because of age, I left childbearing till my 30-ish age. So as a result, the hormones are not what they would be in the 20s. And so, there were some hormonal imbalances and so on that had to be addressed. And that also created that environment for that postpartum depression. And for me, that recovery from all of the trauma I had been through before, plus the depression, I had to go through some counseling. I went through I did a lot of journaling, a lot of writing. The writing and the journaling was very important for my recovery throughout this entire period of time, and for my ability to process what was happening in my relationships, in my emotions, in myself, all of that I needed to process effectively. So journaling and the counseling as well really helped me to get past that emotional challenge, as well as prayer and trusting and believing in God.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing, because like you said, it's as a parent, of course, we want our pregnancy to be, yes. So nice. And then we want at the 9 months, the baby come and they
pops out.
Yeah, the pops out, and you heal quickly, and yes. all their transition from when they should walk and when they should and when they should, yes. And then it's like like when my daughter was born, I couldn't, I had to get cut because the child just refused to come. She was 5 days past her due date. And then when she did come, I had my nipple, I didn't have any nipples, so she wouldn't latch on. So it was like, I never, oh my God. It was so, when the breastfeeding part, I was like, I'm sorry, I'm not doing this again. I am not doing this again. So, but again, even recently a friend of mine was saying that why is it that we don't talk about these things? When it comes
I think
go ahead.
Part of it is that we, in our culture, our Caribbean culture, we're very much about, sweeping under the carpet, just get up and do what you got to do. You know, you fight through. You may be in a tough emotional place, but you fight through, you push through, because that's what we do. You know, I think we kind of inherited that from our forefathers and our mothers before, you know, that history of pushing through no matter what. We endure, we do what we got to do. It might be hard, but we do what we got to do.
Yes.
And unfortunately, there is a benefit in that. There is a benefit in pushing through in spite of the circumstances. But there has to be some point where we can say to ourselves, okay, there has to be a space where I can feel comfortable enough to be vulnerable and to say, this is what I am experiencing, and to receive some kind of feedback, some kind of healing, some kind of restoration for what we are going through. So there has to be a balance of those two things. And I think sometimes we lean too heavily on the side of pushing through no matter what, you know. Sometimes we need a little help to push through. And I think that's where the struggle comes, like being willing to accept the help that we need and being willing to share with others so that we get the help that we need.
Yes. So here's where I want to go, right? Because I do believe that, and recently on the podcast, I interviewed Pastor Trudy Tucker, where we spoke about what if God is the offender. Ooh, wow. that was a hard episode, right? Yes. So guys, if you have not gotten a chance to listen to that one, because she lost her daughter to cancer at age 11, you know, and sometimes God is the offender. So here's where I want to go. I believe that there are three components of the forgiveness. One, forgiving ourselves.
Yes.
Forgiving others for probably what they would have done. And then there is a kind of forgiving God. Yes. And it sounds away, how can you have unforgiveness about God? Yes, you can, because why would he allow my child to be autistic? You know, what did I do so wrong? Why he would allow that? Or somebody that their child might even be Down syndrome, you know? Why would God allow me to marry a man that's going to divorce me or cheat on me, you know? So here's where I want you to go. Out of those three, which one can you relate the most to? And what would you say are some of the strategies to help you to overcome?
I would say all three. All three, because incidentally, when you said there are three things and you haven't seen my book, right? So incidentally, my book actually takes us through three lifelines: the lifeline of forgiving God, the lifeline of forgiving self, and the lifeline of forgiving others. It touches on all three, because for me,
look at Holy Spirit, girl. Exactly. Look at Holy Spirit.
So I had to process through all three of those areas. God was like, you need to forgive me, first of all, and then you need to forgive yourself, and you need to forgive others as well. So all three of those things, I think, are critical and were critical for me and were a part of my process. But in the interest of time, what I will do is narrow down to the lifeline of forgiving God, and to talk a bit about that disappointment that we can experience when we go through tough times with God. And for me, I really had a lot of little areas in my life where I really face the giant of disappointment. In the book, I talk about the giant of disappointment. I share the story of Goliath and how the Israelites faced this huge giant. And their hearts failed them. The scripture says they fled and they ran away. And they were there. If we were there in that time, we might be asking ourselves, God, why did you allow us to spend time preparing for battle only to face this thing that could not be defeated? Why would you allow us to spend time training for battle and putting our supplies together and moving from wherever we were to wherever we've come? Why would you allow us to do all of that, gathering our supplies, everything that we had to do, our tools, sharpening our swords? You just imagine the amount of preparation that those Israelites had to go through to go into battle, right? And then when they get into this battle, you send Goliath, you send something that I cannot defeat. And this is one of the stories that reminds us of the fact that sometimes in our life we may face giants. I called them in the book giants of disappointment. Things that are bigger than we expected them to be, things that feel like we were not able to conquer. I was not able to conquer my son's autism. For me, a big part of it was the fact that not just the diagnosis of autism, but also the fact that I had been praying after that diagnosis. I had been praying for him to be delivered from that. I'd been praying for him to be healed from that. And in spite of my praying and in spite of my coming before God and saying, God, you can heal this. You can heal anything, even if they say it's unhealable, even if they say that there's no way that this could be healed, you could heal it. So why haven't you? I think that was a big part of it for me. Why haven't you healed my son? And when we are in that place of disappointment, we have to recognize that there is a space. It creates a space between us and God. It creates a distance between us and him, a breach that we then have to turn around and mend. We have to turn around and mend, and we have to be in a position of allowing ourselves to surrender to God's will and saying, you know what, God, this didn't quite go the way that I thought it would. This did not work out as I expected. I didn't expect this to be this way. But God, I surrender. God, I allow you to do whatever it is that you are doing in my life. And I am going to step out of my disappointment. I'm going to step out of my dismay about this situation. And I am going to walk instead in surrender. And I think that surrender to God is very, very key to overcoming that area of unforgiveness as it relates to our disappointments in God.
That is so good. I feel like you can't leave us without touching on the forgiving others and the forgiving self. So I know you went down in the others, but give us I'm about practical Christianity, right?
Yes.
And recently I did a video on my YouTube channel about do this one thing and you will not struggle with forgiveness again. And I'll share my little snippet of what, but you have said so much about the God thing, like I'm like, yes. So I feel like you can't leave us just hanging without the self. Just, one thing about, dealing with the forgiveness of yourself. When you make the mistake, when you settle for less than God's best, when you, walk out of his will, whatever and then also give us a tip about when others.
In my book, I have a chapter called Break the Surface. And it's talking about breaking the surface of self-judgment. Because for us, sometimes we can find ourselves swimming in a bit of a sea of regret and self-judgment regarding our situations. In the situation with my son, I blamed myself for his diagnosis. I said it was my fault. It was me. I didn't do something right. I failed God in some way. If I hadn't have traveled, it wouldn't have happened. He wouldn't have come early. There are so many different things that I blamed it on. And I said it was my fault. If I hadn't done this and if I hadn't done that, he would have come on time. It is only later when I had my daughter that I came to the understanding that this is just the body that I have. And the body that I have needs a little help to carry a child to term. So it wasn't my fault. I did not create this body. God created this body. And I had to come to terms with the fact that I was not to blame in this situation. And there are times where we can take on our shoulders things that are not our fault and consider ourselves to be the one at fault. We can take on the blame. We can take on the regret and the pain of that. And then there were other instances where we also say, it's my fault. If I had not done this, then it would not have happened. In the sense of, for instance, one example that I could use from my life is when God spoke to me about leaving my job. And years later, there are times that I would go through that might be a little difficult financially. And I would say, this is my fault. If I didn't leave the job, I would have been good, right? But it's not so simple. there's so many other things that go into some of the things that happen in our lives, some of the decisions that we make. It's not so simple and it's not so straightforward. And I am so thankful for the grace of God, because he shows us and leads us into healing sometimes, to be able to show us in our lives where, hey, yes, you say that this is your fault, but this happened because of this, this, and this. And one of the things that we have to also take into our lives in order to be able to fully forgive ourselves is grace. We have to be able to approach God's throne with confidence. We have to give ourselves that ability to accept grace. We can live so much in that sea of self-judgment. It can close us off from really being able to fully live our lives if we're not careful. That sea of self-judgment can interfere with our sense of identity. It can interfere with our ability to accept the version of us that God is creating us to be. Every time we live in self-judgment, every time we go back to those regrets, we are seeing that we are reinforcing that person that we used to be, that decision that we made, and what that says about us, that we reinforce that over and over again. Whereas when we accept the grace of God, when we walk in his forgiveness for us, and forgive ourselves, it allows us to embrace identity in God. It allows us to embrace who he is calling us to be and who he says that we are. And it also, if we fail to come out of this sea of self-judgment, it also steps into and gets in the way of our relationships with others. Because very often when we judge ourselves, sometimes we anticipate the judgment of others because we have been living in a sea of self-judgment about certain things in our lives. We anticipate that others are going to judge us because of those things. So sometimes even in relation to motherhood, as we've been talking about, because I struggled with that self-judgment in relation to that decision to travel and, concerning my son and so on, and feeling like it was my fault. Sometimes as a mother, I continually have to struggle with anticipating the judgment of others concerning motherhood or my decisions as a mother and so on. And I really have to continue day by day to walk in that grace that God has given and step into that fully, accepting that, yes, he's given me grace. I can accept that forgiveness for myself.
Amen. Amen. And, it all comes down to, this idea that, there's a bigger God than we will ever imagine. Like, we don't understand his ways, but we have to believe by faith that his plans for us are really good. And I think that's the hardest part, God, how can I see goodness in losing my loved one? How can I see goodness, when my children are, it's not how I expect? How can I see God when I leave my 9-to-5 job and I don't see the provision as I ought to? How can I see God in even the hard moments? And I think that's, the biggest struggle of this Christian journey. How can a good God allow, so many bad things to happen? Why? So I think that's the biggest struggle. But the truth is we can't always answer those questions. We can't. Okay. What we can do, though, is tell you that, trust the character of God. That is who he is proven himself to be in your life all the time, over and over again, and just trust that God. So, Jewelle, as we kind of wrap up for this week on the podcast, I want you to tell us a little bit about, your book and what is it that you're working on, or, if there's anything that the Lord would have placed on your heart as we close off.
Okay. Well, in terms of my book is called Rescue Me, the Lifeline of Forgiveness. And this book is for anyone who has ever been disappointed, who's ever broken up with God over some unanswered prayers or some unfulfilled dreams. If you have been tied down by your guilt about your past, by insecurity, if you've been carrying a wounded heart regarding things that have happened in relationship with others, regret, all of that, I really think this book is really important for you. And I want to encourage you listeners to hitch a rescue ride with me on God's Life Boat. This ride of writing the devotional series and then the book that came from that has really been for me transformational. It has really dealt with the root of a lot of the emotional issues and challenges that I experienced. And from my own life experience of going through this process, I know that if you come into this process too, that God will do something great and transformational in your life. And the book does have space for reflection. There are questions at the end of each chapter. There's some journaling space as well that you can reflect. You can think about what the book is challenging you concerning. All those areas of forgiving self, forgiving others, forgiving God come into play there. And the book is available on Amazon.com. If you are located outside of Barbados, you can order the book on Amazon. It's available in Kindle and in print. And for those of you who are in Barbados, it is also available on Amazon, but I do have a limited amount of copies. So if you do want a copy, you can feel free to reach out to me. Contact@therescuelifeline.com is the email address. You can reach out to me in Barbados if you would like to access a copy of the book. I also want to give a free gift to your listeners, if that's okay, Crystal.
Yeah, definitely. We all love free things.
Yes. And if you're interested in a free gift from me, it's called the Forgiveness Fast. It is a 14-day prayer and fasting. It's based on this book, Rescue Me, the Lifeline of Forgiveness. It's available on my website, www.therescuelifeline.com. The Rescue Lifeline .com is where you would find it. If you go to the Forgiveness Fast on the tabs on that website, you would find it there. You can put in your email address and you will get access to a free PDF with the outline for the 14 days of fasting, as well as videos that were recorded when I launched the book back in March of 2022. I did a 14-day pray and fast live online on Facebook, and you can access those recordings as well as the free PDF download. TheRescueLifeline.com is the home of everything related to this book, Rescue Me, the Lifeline of Forgiveness. So there's Rescue Me, the Lifeline of Forgiveness. There's Rescue Us, a marriage devotional that's available on the website as well. There is the Rescue Podcast, a limited podcast series. And my husband and I, we have joined together to found an organization called the Rescue Foundation. And you can read all about that on TheRescueLifeline.com.
All right. Thank you. Thank you again, Jewelle. This was such a beautiful conversation. I'm looking forward to us connecting on different projects. And, we are on one mission, the building of the kingdom. And that I am excited about your transparency and just, the purpose that you bring to all that you do. And I'm happy to connect with you. So I wish you all the best, woman of God.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been awesome. And I look forward to connecting in the future as well.
Yes. So guys, listen, if you are listening to this, I hope that something that was said would have blessed you. Forgiveness is one of those topics that you can't, as I said, you can't learn too much about forgiveness. And it's just this. It's because life is happening, because we're dealing with imperfect people, because we are imperfect ourselves, because we don't always understand the hand and the heart of God. the little offense and the feeling of rejection and the little unforgiveness can creep in. And this is why we always have to just, be equipped to have these conversations as we do here on the Diary of a Jesus Girl podcast. And the idea is that we really want you to just grow in your walk with God. We want you to grow in understanding his identity, your identity in him. And of course, now once you understand purpose, that you will be able to use your gifts to impact lives. That's my desire for you, each and every one of you that are listening to this podcast. So God bless you. Remember to leave a review. Let us know, if there was any takeaway, if you're a mother and you have ever had any experience, with motherhood or how you feel about it. Please leave a review on YouTube or on Apple Podcasts. We would love to hear, your reviews and how whatever takeaway that you would have had. And of course, subscribe and share this with somebody. You don't ever know what somebody is going through, but an encouraging word will be what they need in this season. So God bless you. See you next week for another amazing episode of the Diary of a Jesus Girl podcast, where we discuss real life issues of the committed Christian woman. We're out for this week.
Diary of a Jesus Girl. Jesus Girl. Hey, it's the Diary of a Jesus Girl.